Imagine a peaceful farm in rural Kansas, home to a family living an exemplary, quiet life. Now picture that very farm as the setting of a disturbing event so shocking that it rocked an entire town and inspired one of the most famous books ever written, In Cold Blood by Truman Capote. In this video, you'll discover, step by step, everything that truly happened to the Clutter family on that fateful night in November 1959. We'll uncover surprising details, show you how the investigations unfolded, and explore why, to this day, this case still leaves so many unanswered questions. Stick around until the end. Not only will you learn the real story behind the case that stunned America, but you'll also understand why it continues to intrigue experts and ordinary people alike more than 60 years later. Get ready, because the truth might be more frightening than you imagine. To better understand how one event could completely change the small town of Holcomb, Kansas, first you need to know the story behind the Clutter family. At first glance, they seemed like the perfect family, the kind you see in old movies, living a peaceful, successful life. Herb Clutter, the family patriarch, was a respected man, admired by everyone around him. He was a prosperous farmer, deeply dedicated to his work, known for being fair and kind to his employees. His wife, Bonnie, was quiet and discreet, facing her own personal challenges, but always striving to maintain family unity above everything else. The Clutters had 4 children, 2 of whom were living at home at the time of the tragic events, Nancy and Kenyon. Nancy was a beloved teenager, smart, dedicated, and popular. Her charming personality made her an example to the community, frequently praised for her kindness and warmth. Kenyon, their youngest child living at home, was a curious, introspective young man passionate about inventions and mechanics. Intelligent and creative, he spent hours in his small homemade workshop, always creating something new. But what truly made the Clutters special was how deeply involved they were in their local community. They were active church members, regularly participated in school meetings, and consistently contributed to improving life in Holcomb. To anyone observing from the outside, it was unimaginable that this seemingly perfect, admired family was about to experience a tragedy that would forever alter their destiny. How could such a respected family, with so many friends and so deeply loved by an entire town, find themselves at the center of one of America's most perplexing criminal mysteries? To answer this, we must dive deep into the Clutter family's life, because it is these very details that will explain why this case shocked not only Holcomb, but the entire nation. Stay with me, because the revelations you're about to discover will show that sometimes even the most ordinary families can hide surprising stories, and perfection isn't always what it seems. It was a seemingly ordinary night in November 1959 in Holcomb, Kansas. The Clutter family farm was quiet and peaceful, just as it always was after a long day filled with work and family activities. Herb Clutter had just made sure everything was in order on the farm and was ready to rest. Bonnie, his wife, was likely already asleep, while their children, Nancy and Kenyon, were finishing their usual routines before going to bed. What no one could have imagined was that on that peaceful night, something incredibly unusual was about to happen on that isolated property. By dawn, the town's calm routine would be abruptly shattered, leaving deep scars that would never be forgotten by the local residents. The tranquility of that night would transform into one of the greatest mysteries in American criminal history. The next morning, the first to sense something was wrong were neighbors and close friends of the family. Herb Clutter was known for his punctuality and impeccable routine, so when none of the family appeared at church that Sunday morning, people immediately felt something wasn't right. Concerned and curious, friends decided to visit the property, completely unaware of the shocking scene they were about to discover. Upon entering the farmhouse, the friends encountered a scene they'd never forget. It was evident something serious had occurred. The silence there now felt different. It wasn't the comforting silence from the previous night, but rather an unsettling quietness that hinted at a mystery no one could comprehend at the time. Local authorities were called immediately, and soon the farm, once peaceful, was crowded with investigators, bewildered neighbors, and frightened townspeople. Who could have had any reason to harm a family as respected and seemingly perfect as the Clutters? There were no clear indications of financial issues, family conflicts, or known enemies. Initially, nothing made sense, and the lack of immediate answers only intensified the anxiety. But did no one truly have any motive for such actions? Or were there critical details about that night yet to be uncovered? To understand this, we must carefully explore behind the scenes of the investigation, analyze step by step how the discoveries unfolded, and uncover surprising stories and clues that emerged afterward. Stay tuned, because from this point on, we're diving into revealing details that few people truly know, details that help explain why this case continues to fascinate and haunt generations more than 6 decades later. As soon as authorities arrived at the scene, a sense of unease overtook the quiet town of Holcomb. None of the residents could understand what had happened, or more importantly, who could possibly be behind something so disturbing. Investigators quickly realized they weren't dealing with an ordinary case. The mystery was deep, and the answers initially seemed too distant. A special team of investigators, led by Agent Alvin Dewey, took control of the investigation. Dewey was an experienced man, known for solving complicated cases. However, it soon became clear that he was facing one of the greatest challenges of his career. There were no obvious fingerprints, no direct eyewitnesses, and no immediate clues regarding the motive. It was as if everything had been meticulously planned, leaving investigators scrambling for information. In the first few days after the events, the police interviewed hundreds of people in the area. Neighbors, friends, farm employees, anyone who had even the slightest connection to the Clutter family was questioned thoroughly. Some leads began to slowly emerge, but they seemed scattered and led nowhere. The police desperately needed a solid line of investigation, something that could finally point them in the right direction. Everything changed when the police received crucial information from an unlikely source, a prisoner named Floyd Wells. Floyd informed authorities that he had shared a cell with a man named Richard Hickok and revealed something shocking. Richard had planned to visit the Clutter farm after his release from prison because he believed Herb Clutter kept a large sum of money on the property. This was the first solid lead investigators had, and from that moment on, the investigation took a dramatic turn. Richard Hickok quickly became the prime suspect, but authorities discovered he wasn't alone. Alongside him was Perry Smith, a former prison mate whose intriguing and mysterious personality caught the attention of investigators. Both men had troubled pasts, difficult lives, and lengthy criminal histories. Police intensified their search, following leads across the country, while the residents of Holcomb anxiously awaited answers. But who exactly were these two men? What real motives could they have had for targeting an apparently innocent family? And how did they manage to get so close without raising suspicion? The next steps of the investigation would reveal astonishing and unsettling details about these individuals, uncovering a complex and troubled human side that few could imagine. What would investigators discover when they finally caught up with these men? What revelations would emerge once confronted with hard evidence? If you want to uncover the secrets behind this investigation, stay tuned, because from now on, we'll detail how these two men were tracked, interrogated, and how the pieces of this puzzling case slowly began to fall into place. As the investigation progressed, and the names Richard Hickok and Perry Smith emerged prominently among the suspects, a new layer of mystery began to surround the case. It wasn't enough to simply know who they were. People needed to understand why they had done what they did. The stories behind these two figures revealed far more than mere criminal motives. They exposed two lives deeply scarred by abandonment, violence, frustration, and a series of poor choices. Richard Hickok, often described as outgoing and ambitious, had a seemingly ordinary youth but gradually began making decisions that led him down a troubled path. Intelligent and articulate, Richard dreamed of a comfortable life, yet he wasn't willing to wait or follow conventional routes to achieve it. After getting involved in a series of minor offenses, he ended up in prison, where he met Perry Smith, and everything changed. Perry was the opposite of Richard in many ways. More introverted, with an extremely troubled family background, He bore deep scars from his childhood. His alcoholic father was absent and aggressive, while his mother died when Perry was very young. He grew up bouncing between foster homes and institutions, subjected to neglect and harsh punishment. Art and music became his only refuges, and he filled notebooks with drawings and personal reflections. Those who knew him described something enigmatic about his eyes, a mixture of fragility and constant tension. The connection between Richard and Perry wasn't immediate but grew stronger over time, especially within the prison environment. They saw themselves as survivors of a system that, in their distorted view, had denied them opportunities. It was there, behind bars, that they devised a plan that would forever link their names to the Clutter family. Richard believed there was a large sum of money hidden at the Clutter farm, and he convinced Perry to join him on a visit there. What began as a simple quest for money would escalate into something neither of them had anticipated. Or at least, that's what many believe. During interrogations, the two men provided differing accounts of the events. Richard attempted to minimize his responsibility, shifting some of the blame onto Perry, while Perry alternated between deep silences and fragmented confessions. Frequently, their stories contradicted each other, making it even harder to piece together exactly what happened that night in Holcomb. It's precisely this duality between what was stated openly and what remained hidden that continues fueling debate about the case today. Who were Richard Hickok and Perry Smith, really? Were they cold, calculating individuals or products of a society that failed to provide them support, structure, and hope? The answer might lie in what came next. The trial, testimonies, evidence, and details that only emerged when both men finally faced justice. And that's precisely what we'll explore in the next part of this video. Prepare yourself, because the trial of the Clutter case was not just a series of formal testimonies. It turned into a national spectacle, filled with tension, shocking revelations, and moral dilemmas that still echo today. When Richard Hickok and Perry Smith were finally captured and brought to justice, the Clutter family case had already surpassed the borders of the small town of Holcomb and gained national attention. The media, fascinated by the details and by the stark contrast between the accused and their victims, turned the trial into a public spectacle. For many, the courtroom was the stage where the truth would finally be revealed, but what unfolded was far more complex than anyone expected. From the beginning, the trial was charged with tension. The courtroom was constantly filled with reporters, onlookers, and community members paying close attention to every testimony, every word, every expression. The prosecution built a solid case, presenting evidence linking Richard and Perry to the Clutter home. Items found in their possession, witness statements, and the key testimony of Floyd Wells, the man who had informed authorities about Hickok's plan while still in prison. The defense, in contrast, focused on the personal traumas of the accused, attempting to frame their actions within the context of their troubled pasts. In Perry Smith's case, especially, his emotional and family history was laid bare. They aimed to show that he was, above all, a deeply broken man, scarred from childhood. This approach divided public opinion. Some saw it as a humanizing angle, while others viewed it as an attempt to excuse the inexcusable. Throughout the trial, there were intense moments during the testimonies. Perry and Richard contradicted each other, pointed fingers, and each tried in their own way to reduce their level of involvement. Their cold expressions were occasionally interrupted by fleeting moments of emotion, making their behavior even harder to interpret. The jury, made up of everyday citizens, faced the difficult task of analyzing not only the evidence, but also the silences, the pauses, and the glances, those subtle cues that could shift the outcome of the case. After weeks of tension, the verdict was announced: guilty. The sentence was clear and final, bringing a sense of closure for many, yet also raising new questions. The Clutter case had shaken the foundations of an entire town, but now it also stirred deeper conversations about justice, punishment, and human nature itself. Was this truly a fitting end? Or was there more to consider? The impact of the trial echoed across the country. Before long, the case became the subject of debates, articles, books, and, of course, Truman Capote's famous work, which would introduce a new way of telling real stories with emotional and literary depth. But before we get to that, we need to understand how this trial forever changed the way society views not just crime, but also those who commit it. In the next part of this video, we'll dive into how this story was transformed into one of the most powerful works in American literature, and how a writer's unique perspective reshaped the way the world sees the Clutter case. Stay with me. This story is far from over. Shortly after the tragedy that shook Holcomb, a curious and charismatic figure began drawing attention in the small town: the writer Truman Capote. Known for his refined writing style and eccentric personality, Capote was not the kind of person one would expect to see walking through a quiet Kansas town. Yet, he became completely fascinated by the emotional depth and complexity of the Clutter family case. And he wasn't there by accident. Capote saw in that story something far beyond the facts. To him, the Clutter case was the perfect portrait of a social and emotional rupture. On one side, an exemplary family. On the other, two men shaped by tragedy and destructive decisions. He believed it was a rare opportunity to explore the human condition in all its layers: goodness, darkness, trauma, morality, regret, and the fragile decisions that shape a person's destiny. Alongside his close friend, the author Harper Lee, famous for To Kill a Mockingbird, Capote immersed himself in the investigation. Together, they interviewed townspeople, police officers, witnesses, and even the accused themselves, forming a close and often controversial relationship with Perry Smith. Capote was particularly fascinated by him, not just because of the case, but because of the emotional complexity he perceived in his eyes. Perry was not just a name in a court file. To Capote, he was a human mystery. This deep dive into the case gave rise to one of the most groundbreaking works in American literature, In Cold Blood. Published in 1966, the book didn't just recount the facts with journalistic precision. It narrated them with unprecedented emotional and literary weight. Capote created what many consider the first nonfiction novel, a style that blends investigative journalism with literary storytelling. The result was powerful and unforgettable. The book caused a massive impact. People who had never shown interest in true crime stories began to see them in a new light. Capote's work raised questions that went far beyond the case itself. To what extent does environment shape a person? What defines the line between victim and perpetrator? And is it possible to understand, not just judge, those responsible for extreme actions? In Cold Blood's influence was so deep that it's still studied in universities, adapted into films and series, and serves as a reference for journalists and writers who aim to tell real stories with emotional depth and human perspective. More than just a book about a crime, it became a mirror of American society at the time, and in many ways, a reflection of ourselves. In the next chapter of this video, we'll explore the unanswered questions that still linger. Because even with trials, confessions, and best-selling books, some mysteries remain. And maybe that's exactly why this story continues to live on, not just in literature, but in our collective memory. Even after the arrest, trial, and conviction of Richard Hickok and Perry Smith, the Clutter family case remains surrounded by unanswered questions. While In Cold Blood appeared to organize the facts in a definitive way, there are gaps, contradictions, and lingering doubts that have stood the test of time, fueling debates, theories, and independent investigations to this day. One of the biggest questions that remains is, was the act fully premeditated, or did something go wrong along the way? Although Richard claimed their original plan was simply to steal a large sum of money that Herb Clutter supposedly kept in the house, no such money was ever found. This raises suspicions. Was there another hidden motivation? Or had the pair already harbored darker intentions from the very beginning? Perry, for his part, shifted between vague confessions and moments of denial, making it nearly impossible to know exactly what happened inside the house that night. Another lingering mystery involves the dynamic between the two men. Who was really in control? Who influenced whom? While Richard came across as more confident and assertive, Perry often showed a more sensitive, conflicted side. Some believe Perry was manipulated, a tool in Hickok's hands. Others argue that despite his softer appearance, he was the one hiding a deeper emotional and impulsive nature. The truth? It was never fully clarified. There are also those who question whether others might have been involved, either directly or indirectly, before or after the crime. Although the official story has always pointed to only 2 perpetrators, there were reports of suspicious activity and conflicting witness accounts in the area around the time of the incident. Nothing was ever proven, but these uncertainties keep the flame alive for those who believe the case may not have been completely solved. Another point of debate is the fairness of the trial itself. Was it truly impartial? At a time when public outrage was high and the media treated the case as a national spectacle, it's fair to ask whether the jury was able to remain completely unbiased. There was an overwhelming desire for swift justice, and that pressure may have influenced how the process unfolded. What's most striking is that, more than 60 years later, the Clutter case still touches on deeply relevant themes: inequality, untreated trauma, quiet forms of violence, and the influence of one's background on life choices. Perhaps of why this story continues to be revisited, studied, adapted, and debated in so many forms. Because it speaks to something far beyond the investigation. It speaks to the human condition and our vulnerability in the face of irreversible decisions. And you, what do you believe really happened that night? Did the plan spiral out of control? Was there more that was never revealed? Or are we simply trying to fill in gaps that may never be fully explained? In the next and final chapter of this video, we'll reflect on why this story still resonates today and what it teaches us about justice, memory, and humanity. Stay with me until the end, because some stories don't end, they just keep echoing. More than 6 decades have passed since that quiet night on the Clutter family farm, and yet something about this case continues to draw us back. It's not just the severity of what happened, it's the profound humanity that the story carries. Why do we remember this case so vividly? What makes it so different, so unforgettable, that it continues to inspire books, films, and endless debates? Perhaps it's the stark contrast between the worlds that collided that night. On one side, a family that symbolized stability, kindness, and traditional values. On the other, 2 men carrying the weight of broken childhoods, wrong turns, and lives shaped by the margins of society. That collision forces us to reflect not just on justice, but on what drives someone across certain lines, and why, even with official verdicts, the unease lingers. Truman Capote's book immortalized the case, but it was the raw essence of the story that gave it lasting power. The Clutter case lives on because it doesn't just belong to the past. It lives in our fears, in the questions we avoid asking, and in our endless quest to understand how the human mind really works. When we examine this story, we're ultimately looking inward, into our certainties, our judgments, our doubts, and the extremes of human behavior. And perhaps that's exactly why this story refuses to fade. Because behind the names, dates, and facts, there's a question that still echoes. How well do we really know people? And how much do we truly understand about what we ourselves are capable of or willing to avoid when pushed to the edge? If this story touched you, stirred something inside, or made you reflect, that means it fulfilled its purpose. So I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments. What do you think really happened that night? If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. Here, we'll always dive deep into real stories that challenge the way we think and feel. Thank you for staying with me until the end, and I'll see you in the next mystery.